And I am pleased to say I'm joined by one of my favourite human beings on the planet, the erudite and informed Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Great to have your company, Alan. We haven't caught up for a while, actually.
Indeed.
And normally when I have you in here, I'm sort of getting you to unpack and explain everything going on in the rest of the world. And today I'd rather you kind of unpack and explain what's going on here. And the first thing I want to ask you is, you know, your incredible think tank, which for those of you who don't know what it does, it sort of focuses on Middle East extremism, terrorism. I know it's undergone, you know, a lot of projects where it's explored the far right as well as terrorist organisations and perhaps religious minorities, Islamists and so on and so forth. So I want to get your take on how Sir Keir Starmer has framed what's gone on here with the riots when he talks about these people being far right. I mean, is he just defining a voice of opposition? Is he defining their acts? Is he calling a lot of people with a certain set of viewpoints far right? Or have we got an organised network of far-right extremists who were partaking in those particular riots?
Well, in a sense, it's all of those, Alex. The reality is, though, that the far right is alive and kicking in the UK. There's no doubt about it. It is an organised network in the sense that there are different people in different groups, things like the Patriotic Alliance. You know, people have been talking about the EDL, the English Defence League. Actually, that hasn't existed for a number of years, but it has splintered into different offshoot groups who, you know, sort of do sometimes get together and cause trouble together. There's no doubt that while many of the protesters were protesting genuinely about the issue of migration and were not far right, because it is not far right to talk about migration, it is about being a concerned citizen. But did some far-right groups then hijack those protests and use them as a pretext for causing trouble? Absolutely. We can see that's happened through disinformation on social media. We can trace it back, and indeed by the actual activities and who's been arrested and jailed. So there's definitely been a seizure of the far-right of some of these issues. You know, historically, the far-right have campaigned on these issues, as have other people who are not, you know, even people on the left have campaigned on them. So it's a bit of a mixture. But it's lazy to call it all far right. That's a reality. You've got to be more nuanced about it.
Talking about the prosecutions, and we had the sort of, you know, the show trials, if you will, the judge judification, as I've been calling it, of our justice system. And I haven't sort of sat there watching and monitoring every single one, but of the ones that were sort of quite high profile in the early aftermath, after the riots, where I think that we were all basically being told, look, this is what we're going to do to you. We're going to whack it up on TV screens, get back in your houses, and don't you think of picking up a brick. When I saw the litany of those who were being prosecuted, they seemed to me hooligans and people who had, you know, a regular relationship with the police, let's say. They were burglars, they had sort of caused a fray on numerous occasions. I wasn't aware until today, actually, of anybody being lifted, for want of a better phrase, for actually having a connection to organised far-right activism, if you could call it, extremism, terrorism. This morning, I understand there might be 2 young people who have been arrested with actually trying to organise far-right activities. But I didn't really see amongst that cohort people who I thought had a manifesto and a brown shirt.
Well, no, that's where it gets very interesting. So there's been a lot of talk about, oh, was this terrorism? You know, and actually, it probably wasn't. It was hate crimes in some cases, but not terrorism, because terrorism, you have to have a clear political agenda and be essentially proud of what you're doing and take credit for something in the name of your political cause with your sort of suggestion this happens. So, for example, there has been, you know, in the world, far-right terrorists, and a good example was the guy who attacked the mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand. He went in with a clear manifesto. It was a very political, obvious thing that he was doing, and as a result...
Or Anders Breivik, for example.
Another example, yes, precisely. So there are examples of far-right terrorists. Now, it's interesting you speak about the hooligan aspect. Actually, there's been a long-term history between so-called hooligans, football hooligans, and the far right. They have, you know, they've been, whether they're organised ties or disorganised ties, there have been for 30, 40, 50 years, that kind of element that sort of seeped in. So some of it isn't that I'm a card-carrying member of this, but I've got lots of sympathy with what they're doing. But that's why I say it's very difficult to categorise, you know, all of these riots as far right per se. Yeah, there's clearly a far right element and there's a far right problem, but you know, you can't say that it's been purely directed by the far right. But of course, we have to stress, just from where you started on the sort of trial issue, if there is disorder, it has to be stamped down upon. And I've got no no problem with rioters and others being jailed very quickly for if there's obvious evidence they've committed those crimes. But what we want to look at, of course, is to make sure that occurs across the system and that everyone who causes disorder is similarly jailed.
Do you think it's appropriate, though? I mean, a 15-year-old is now the first one in England to be charged with this category of rioting, which is going to be an offence that carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison, which is double that of violent disorder. I don't know what this particular youngster has done in respect to rioting. He initially pleaded guilty to violent disorder and burglary at a hearing earlier on. I wonder, when we have so many people who are going about the place, wielding knives, mugging people, getting away with it, being released early from prison. You know, one thing I find quite peculiar, let's say, is when Sir Keir Starmer first took office, one of his flagship policies was 1/3 of people in prison don't need to be there. And he had James Timpson, of course, who believes in the rehabilitation of prisoners, believes in trying to get people to turn their lives around, giving them the decency and dignity of employment, getting them as sort of upstanding members of the community once again. And it was stressed that, you know, there are people in there who, frankly, are a victim of their circumstance, let's say, or who have put a foot wrong, but actually it would be far better, rather than banging them up for long sentences, to actually sort of, you know, work with them to get them to, you know, become
change their lives. Change their lives.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. And then here you have, straight away, just after that, a 15-year-old, and I don't know anything about him. No doubt he is a bit of a toe rag. But at that age, if he got something like 10 years in prison, I mean, that is the opposite of rehabilitation. That's life-changing. That is life-destroying. Do you see that as a bit of a volte-face?
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, again, you've got to look at the details of the case, and I haven't, so I don't want to, you know, judge what's happened there without knowing what's gone on. But clearly, if he's up on a very serious charge, one has to assume he has committed a very serious offence. And, you know, just as we wouldn't have said years ago, the Jamie Bulger killers, oh, they were kids, let's let them turn. You know, at some point you cross a line. If you cross a line and your violence is sufficient that it is, you know, if you like, a real societal threat, then it might be the case that you need a different set of settings in order for you to recalibrate your life and to, you know, also secure punishment for what you did. So I think, there's no hard and fast rules here.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, actually, let's stick on this particular story, because he pleaded guilty to violent disorder and burglary. So in there, we don't have ABH, we don't have GBH, we don't have a human being who's actually being physically hurt, as far as I can tell by the initial charges. And actually, Chris Wilson, who was defending the boy who's from Sunderland, told the court that this fresh charge raises a number of complex issues, and those issues may well have far wider repercussions. And he said the situation doesn't sit comfortably with me, professionally or personally. And like I said, we have people who are carrying knives. I mean, now you've got a situation where if you've got a zombie knife, you can just take it to the cop shop and get a tenner. And then, you know, if you're carrying something like that, you probably mean to inflict some pretty serious mutilating damage, quite frankly. And it's amazing how normalised we're becoming, especially in cities like London. Just seeing videos of people having, I don't know, machete duels in the middle of the street at 11 o'clock in the morning.
It's extraordinary.
And then this kid is, I don't know what he's done. One assumes he's kicked in the window of Lush and stolen a bath bomb. I mean, who knows? It probably was pretty.
It seems,
horrific,
Alex, that new evidence has come to light since he pled guilty that suggests that it was more dangerous than what was originally assumed. So I think, without knowing what that new evidence is, we probably shouldn't pass judgment on the case. But you're right about the other issue. The other issue being that, you know, it seems that anyone carries a knife these days. There's no problem at all. I mean, we even saw, didn't we, during these riots, a police officer of some kind telling people who I assume were from the Muslim community, we know you've got weapons. If you've got weapons, leave them at the mosque. So rather than arresting people for carrying weapons, fine, just leave them there, it's not a problem.
Yeah,
so
nothing to see here.
No, but I think there's a problem there, isn't there?
Yeah,
and you've mentioned in London the same issues. People aren't getting 10 years for that. But clearly, if you're carrying a knife, you know, which has the potential of, you know, one of these zombie knives or whatever, that has potential to, end someone's life, that is not just a casual thing. That's not you defending yourself, is it? That's you going out there with the intent of causing some harm, and that probably needs to be recognised in, in the sentencing and indeed in the categorisation of the crime as well. So I think part of this is about the CPS, isn't it? And we've got a problem with the CPS who have...
Which is basically Sir Keir Starmer's pet organisation, it seems.
But what's going on with the CPS? What is happening here with their sort of decision-making when it comes to who are we charging, who are we not charging, what are we charging them for? I think a lot of people have been targeting the police recently. Probably far better to target the CPS and look at what's going on there. OK, well,
it's interesting you say that, because what we're hearing from supporters of Sir Keir Starmer is he's been very hands-on in telling them how he wants them to run their affairs with the televised trials. And people say, well, he has passed form on this after the 2011 riots and the 24-hour courts. We didn't see those televised in quite the same way. We didn't necessarily see the sentences meted out as strict as they are this time round. But people say, well, look, this is his métier, this is his expertise. But do you think there perhaps needs to be a little bit more separation between the man in number 10 and the Crown Prosecution Service, which he may have once headed, but should surely be independent of political influence?
Well, yeah, that is the interesting part. If these stories are correct and he's intervening to that extent, it sets a rather worrying precedent for all manners of kind of government agencies, because you can't really have the PM micromanaging all these institutions. It becomes very difficult as well. You start doing it now. Well, what happens later down the line when something else goes on? You don't intervene. People then go, oh, did you think this issue was more important than that issue? Probably for his sake, he needs to sort of take a step back and go, right, I'm going to trust, I've delegated, to the people who lead this agency. They're the people in charge. If I don't like what they're doing, my recourse to them is to replace them and work through them. But that's really what, strategically, we'd expect the PM to do.
I want to go back to what you were saying about the fact that there seem to be, and we don't know, look, the other day I saw there was a slate of prosecutions against men who appeared to be from, say, the Muslim community, that they have also stood trial for disarray and incitement to violence and are quite rightly going to be sent to clink, although that didn't reach the live broadcasting status that the earlier prosecutions did. But the perception, actually, of there being a group of men being told, put your weapons back in the mosque, please, go home. Now, I kind of understand policing in favour of the best possible outcomes. But we've got to a stage now where a fellow journalist of mine that I know very well was put on social media by a Muslim organisation who had a grid of faces and said, these people are enemies of Islam. And she now has to go to bed every night with a panic button under her pillow. I mean, is this something we should also be talking about in the context of what we saw erupt on our streets a few weeks ago?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about these riots is that they have sparked a wider conversation, haven't they, about, what might cause disorder, what might cause criminality. And clearly, if there is, sort of a hit list, as it were, of people who are regarded as enemies of anything, then it's not a good idea for that to be broadcast, because you will end up with hotheads going, oh, I'm going to act on that. I'm acting in defence of my religion or my cause or whatever it might be, and you are essentially provoking violence, aren't you?
Well, so, I would think so. You say it sparked a wider conversation. I kind of worry the opposite's happened and that we're not having a wider conversation here in the United Kingdom. You and I might be, stations like this might be still trying to fight the good fight, but I get the impression actually that the sentiment out there in Britain is we're not allowed to talk about these things, that actually we're all worried now that we're going to get in trouble for doing so. The wider conversation, it seems to me, is happening everywhere else in the world. Now, you've just come back from America, haven't you, who have suffered all sorts when it comes to the hands of Antifa, BLM activism, clashes on the street.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a happy place, is it? Yes.
Yeah, and they're looking at us going, wow, that's a basket case country.
Well, that's the amazing thing. I was with, I travelled across the northeast of the US, and everywhere I went, when people, obviously heard my accent, they were like, oh, the UK, well, we think we've got problems here, but you guys, you've really got problems. So the idea that the US, which is so politically split, so, sort of, so many insults being hurled between different sorts of people and looks on the verge of, a sort of at least a verbal civil war, the fact that they're looking down on us going, well, at least we're not you guys, tells you something about how Britain is currently being seen around the world.
We've got other countries basically sending travel advisors to their citizens saying, if you go to the UK, don't go out at night, don't go on the streets of London. I mean, the Labour Party came along and said, we're going to be the party of growth. I can't imagine a single business right now from a foreign country saying, oh, yeah, we want to invest in the UK. That looks like a really good place to set up shop. It seems to me to have been an unmitigated disaster.
Well, here's the funny thing, though, Alex. If you've seen the economic figures, it's not an unmitigated disaster. On the contrary, we've got the strongest sort of period of sustained growth for many years, which, by the way, tells you that all this talk the economy was left in a disastrous state is nonsense.
I don't think the Labour Party can take credit for that particular economic growth.
I'm not suggesting they take... But look, at the end of the day, investors make decisions based on what's going on economically and what's going on socially. Can they get a return on their investment and how does it look? The underlying economy right now is looking very decent. Okay, in that sort of way. Now, what's not looking decent is the climate, on the streets, the social compact, how that's looking. And so what we run the risk of, we don't get a control on, sort of public disorder and crime. You just run the risk that people who ought to be investing in the UK because going, you know what, it looks like it's turned the corner economically, they may well go, well, yeah, it may do that, but what if it slips back? What if this disorder, or indeed the economic problems that might be coming down the line with tax rises, with, sort of swinging employment issues that are going to harm productivity, maybe that's going to destroy what we were looking to invest in. So I think probably people are holding back on the investment despite the good economic figures because they're worried about where the country is going, both socially but also on the, employment legislation and tax perspectives.